All right, well, the participants are still pouring in here, I can see from the numbers. I do also want to be respectful of people's time. So we will just begin perhaps with some introductory comments, and hopefully everybody will catch up to us. We've got over 200 people who've just joined in the last 90 seconds, so, and more coming in. So in any event, good morning, and thank you all so much for being here and for joining our e311 COVID Federal Assistance Program workshop, a partnership between Bloomberg Philanthropies and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. A special welcome to Laura Waxman and Dave Burns from the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Always great to have you with us, expanding and sharing our reach to cities. We are thrilled to have such an exciting panel of speakers from the Department of Justice, the Department of Treasury, and the Department of Homeland Security to share insights today on compliance and reporting for the COVID response and recovery funding, which has been coming forth the last year and a half. Before we dive into the substance of the program, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague from Bloomberg Associates, Adam Freed, to just give a little bit of background about the e311 COVID Federal Assistance Program. Adam?
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rose, and welcome to all of you who are joining us today. With the passage of the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, a vast landscape of federal funding has been made available to support COVID response and recovery efforts in cities. But we recognize and understand that the rules and regulations governing these funding streams can be difficult to understand, and there's been a lot of frequently evolving rules and regulations and mandates around them. We launched the e311 Federal Assistance Program, as Rose said, in partnership with the U.S. Conference of Mayors to support you in navigating the guidance and funding regulations around these programs to help you secure your city's full share of federal funding and to be able to retain it and make sure that you're complying with all the rules and regulations that govern it. Since the program launched, we've answered more than 300 direct questions from municipal staff, and I imagine many of you on the call today have submitted some of those questions, and supported over 800 cities in the use, tracking, and reporting on that federal aid. Now, link to the hub where all of this information is being stored should magically appear in a moment in the chat. And on that website, you also find recordings from previous programs like this one, and all the materials from today's program will be shared with you, and a recording of it will be posted online. I encourage anyone who hasn't yet visited the website or used the service to please do so. There's a really wealth of information that's easily searched and able to find it there. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Rose, and to kick off today's program.
Thank you, Adam. And now for just a few housekeeping items and just in advance of the introduction of our tremendous speakers. The workshop is going to last for about 75 minutes. We invite you to submit questions in the chat box. We may take a few questions throughout the webinar just to make this very interactive, but we'll also have a very substantive QA session and discussion at the end of the program. In addition to that, our speakers have graciously offered to follow up with any questions that we may run out of time for, so we'll get back in touch with you on anything along those lines. And lastly, remember to check the e311 hub that Adam just described for updates that we'll be adding in the upcoming weeks. So I would also be remiss if I didn't thank my colleagues, Jamie Lavin, Julia Appelfeld, Jillian Gray from Bloomberg for helping to set up the program. And I also want to thank Lisa Rihulo, who's the Associate Director at the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, fondly known as PRAC, for all of her programming assistance. And so now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers who hail from several important departments as it relates to both the funding and its oversight. First, we have Michael Horowitz, Chair of the PRAC and Inspector General for the Department of Justice. Mike and I were colleagues together years ago in the Southern District of New York, and it's a pleasure to have him, and I thank him for organizing today's program. From Treasury is Richard Delmar, Deputy Inspector General, and Debbie Harker, the Assistant Inspector General for Audit in the OIG's office, and Dr. Joseph Kafari, Inspector General for the Department of Homeland Security. And so with that, I will turn it over to Michael Horowitz to kick off the presentation today. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you to Bloomberg Philanthropies and to the Conference of Mayors for having us today. This is Very important program for us. In my day job, I'm the Inspector General of the Justice Department. I'm also the chair of the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. And we were set up, as I'll get into more detail here, to oversee the over now $5 trillion in pandemic funding that has been authorized by Congress over the last now nearly 2 years. And if we go to the first slide, you can see how that $5 trillion number adds up. We had obviously the CARES Act, which was 2 years ago now, March of 2020, $2.1 trillion. We've had various other supplemental appropriations. And then, of course, we had the American Rescue Plan earlier this year, $1.9 trillion, all of that adding up to $5+ trillion. And in the CARES Act in March of 2020, Congress created the PRAC, the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. And you'll hear that acronym a fair amount through our presentations today. The PRAC was created to help do two important things, I think, overall. One was to ensure transparency to pandemic spending, to ensure that the public knew where its money was going, how its money was being spent, whether it was being spent well, and whether there was waste, fraud, abuse associated with it, and to make sure that, and this was the second principle, there was accountability for how the money was spent, and to ensure that it was not only spent appropriately from a federal agency standpoint, but again, to ensure that if there was fraud, waste, and abuse in programs, that those who engaged in that wrongdoing were held to account for it. So those are our two principal missions, transparency and accountability. We do that by bringing together the over 40 federal inspectors general who have oversight responsibilities for various parts of these $5 trillion plus in spending. The PRAC is formally created with including 21 of those IGs, the federal IGs. But one of the things we have done here, and I'm going to talk about as well, in undertaking these efforts is ensuring that we are partnering with our state and local counterparts, whether those are state and local inspectors general, whether those are state and local auditors. We have worked closely with them, and that has been really transformational for us in this effort, because as I think we all know, overseeing and managing $5 trillion requires extraordinary efforts and a new way of thinking, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So I go to the next slide, just to give you the context of what this $5 trillion in spending looks like. In 2009, we had one of the largest, if not the largest at the time, ever recovery packages to try and deal with the Great Recession. That would involve $860 billion, which was a tremendous amount of money to try and address the Great Recession. And in that bill, Congress created the Recovery and Accountability Transparency Board. It also comprised of federal IGs. That's what the PRAC model is based on, to oversee that funding. Well, just to give you a sense of how that number compares currently, we're looking at a current spending number of 6 to 7 times that, what was then the largest number ever in this $5 trillion plus spending. And by comparison, the entire federal government spending in FY19, the year before the pandemic, was about $4.5 trillion. So if we go to the next slide, some of the numbers. The first box obviously is changing, sadly, rapidly. So total number of cases, total deaths obviously also going up now by about 1,000 plus a day. But the other numbers is what I'm going to focus on here, which is there are 44 federal agencies that were involved in various pandemic-related programs. We're dealing with an enormous number of programs here, many that are new, managed by a wide-ranging number of federal agencies. To date, about $3.5 trillion of that $5 trillion has been spent. About $4 trillion or so has been obligated. So there is As many of you know, this is particularly true for the state local programs. There is a time period for spending that goes obviously into the future, into 2024 for several programs. So there is money that has been spent, there is money that's been obligated, and then there is money that remains to be spent. There have been about 14.5 million award recipients to date, and 3 programs account for about 2.4 billion of the spending that has occurred so far. About $800 billion in payroll protection plan loans, about $840 billion in economic impact payments. Those are the $600 checks, et cetera, that people got in the various bills that went out to most Americans. And then there's the $860 billion in unemployment benefits. So those 3 programs, just to give you a sense of this, account for about $2.4 billion of the spending. And as all of you know, another $500 billion, half a trillion dollars, is spending that goes to state local governments through the CARES Act spending, which was about $150 billion, and the American Rescue Plan spending, which is about $350 billion. So next slide. Transparency and the PRAC's responsibility for transparency. I encourage everybody, take a moment, go to pandemicoversight.gov. It's a website we set up within 30 days of our creation back in April 2020 to track where every dollar went. Now, as an asterisk, we can't and haven't been able to track where every dollar spent because early on, there wasn't a requirement that money that had gone out was tracked at a granular level. So we can see at a macro level where the money went out, but we can't always see at a granular level where the money went out. That has changed over time, and it has gotten much better. We actually have issued a few reports to the Office of Management and Budget at the federal level on its need to improve tracking of spending. I will say that, and as you'll hear, the Treasury OIG, my colleagues at Treasury OIG did a tremendous job working with our counterparts at the state and local level to ensure that the money that went to state and local entities was well tracked. So I just want to give a shout out to everybody on the call who was involved in helping in that effort and has been doing their part to make sure that the public, the taxpayers, can see how the money was being spent. That's going to be critically important, not only to make sure the money went to the right places and wasn't stolen or defrauded. And as an aside, when we've launched this website and we've put these funding streams out there, we've gotten tips from the public about money that went to the wrong people for the wrong reasons. And we've followed up with that with criminal and civil investigations. But importantly, it also helps understand not only where the money went, and on our website, you can go to the zip code level to see where the money went, but we can also then understand what kind of impact did this kind of funding have. And I'll talk a little bit later about our work that we're doing, but we have impact studies going on in 6 locations, 2 in cities, 2 in rural communities, 2 in Native American communities, to see how these funding streams impacted those communities. What lessons can we learn from how this money has been spent? Where was it spent well? And where was it spent to try and accomplish certain objectives that maybe weren't reached? And how could future disaster relief efforts be helped by learning about this? So that's why tracking here is so important. Again, I'd encourage you to go to pandemicoversight.gov and you can see that. Next slide. What else can you see on pandemicoversight.gov? You can see not only the federal IG oversight reports, but this is the game changer also that's occurred with this relief effort. Our partnership with state and local oversight entities, whether they're, again, IGs, auditors, by other names in the local communities, what we've done is we've made our website available to them, to our counterparts, so they can post their reports on our website. And so we now have 300 plus federal IG reports, but we also have almost 200 state and local reports. And that, I'm telling you, is a complete change and a very significant positive change. I've heard from so many of my colleagues in the state and local community on how important that's been to them. The larger offices have their own websites, but some of the very small offices actually don't even have websites where they can readily post some reports, 1 and 2 person IG offices. So this has been a tremendous help to them, and something I know we're all very proud of being able to do jointly with our state and local counterparts. Next slide. And on accountability. So talk transparency, on accountability, fighting the fraud. Sadly, when you put out $5 trillion, or to date $3.5 trillion, as we all know, fraudsters are going to follow where the money is. And that's been the case here. And we've seen various levels of fraud with various programs. But we've done several things to try and deal with that. Another game changer has been the first item you see there on the screen, the PACE, the Pandemic Analytics Center of Excellence. That's something new for us as IGs. And Congress funded us with $40 million in the American Rescue Plan to set up this data analytics platform that hopefully will not only be here for this effort, but for future disaster relief, recovery, and other oversight efforts to make sure the monies go into the right place. And it will help us both on the audit side and on the investigation side. And it's already been doing that. Every record we get is going into this data analytics platform. We now have 150 million plus records that we have in place. The PRAC has hired data scientists. That's been one of our focuses of effort, to get data scientists to come in to look through those records for various anomalies. And as you might guess, we're finding them. We're finding instances where, for example, one address in San Francisco was used for 1,300 different applications. One gas station was used, a telephone number for a gas station was used for 150 applications. Web addresses that connect overseas, multiple uses of the same IP address. Things like that we're able to mine and look for indicia of fraud. But as I said, it's also a platform that our auditors can use to understand, as we look at issues and questions that come up, how the data there helps inform our understanding of the use of money and how it benefited people or could be used in a better way to help people. We've also set up a fraud task force with not only our IG partners in the law enforcement community, in the Inspector General law enforcement community. By the way, just to give you a sense of this, the 40 plus IGs whose agencies got money through the various pandemic appropriations, there are 10,000 or so auditors in those 40 IG offices. 3,400 or so agents, federal law enforcement agents, work in those offices. We're leveraging all of those resources as part of our fraud task force, and we're also partnering with federal law enforcement agencies like the FBI, the Secret Service, and state and local counterparts to the extent they have law enforcement authority. We've also created an identity fraud reduction and redress working group, because what we're seeing is not only is the public at large victimized by these thefts, not only are the people who would have benefited from the money had it not been stolen victims of these frauds, but identity theft is being used to get this money in many instances, and that leaves people with their credit history being messed up and other issues that come with identity theft. That's proven to be a huge issue that we're learned about, and actually the president issued a statement about the importance of this, and is one of the mandates he gave to his team to look at as well. And you can see some of the data there on what indictments, arrests, and convictions look like today. So if we go to the next slide, just a couple of other items here. You can see how we're connecting with state, local oversight entities. We're having regular monthly meetings. We've got a group of participants that include not only the PRAC, but state and local auditors, GAO, federal IG staffs, and all of the different individuals at the state and local level discussing these key areas amongst the issues. Next slide. Another thing that's brand new, we've created here at the PRAC a state auditor in residence. We're going to detail a state auditor to the PRAC for 6 to 12 months to work with us on cross-cutting projects, to give us their insights. So again, something we've never done at the federal level. Again, hopefully this is the beginning of what will grow into a much broader program. And so we're piloting it now with 1 or 2 mid-level or senior auditors. But like I said, my hope is we can expand on that. If I can have the next slide. We're also trying to identify lessons learned. And something very important, given we've had 1.5 years now of experience. We issued a report at the end of 2021, can boil it down to 5 basics. Verify eligibility before sending money. There was an honor system that went on initially in the first few weeks and months. You sort of self-certified, basically you were entitled to the money. As we found, some fraudsters perhaps weren't the most honest people in the world, and they certified they were entitled to money they weren't entitled to. Underserved communities need to be ensured better access to relief funds. We found all sorts of issues, including applications that needed to go through the internet, or generally needed to go through the internet, and underserved communities not having access to internet, reliable internet service. Using existing data to prevent fraud, something we're doing, the agency should be doing. Getting guidance, this I'm sure will be something you'll all nod to, getting out guidance quickly and accurately to recipients. Something we've heard about over and over again from state and local counterparts, from other businesses, business communities, that federal agencies needing to get that guidance out there. And then letting the public see what happened with the money. It took us months to get the data that you can see now on pandemicoversight.gov. In some cases, almost 1 year. That has to happen much quicker. Next slide, I'm just about done here. We've had stakeholder listening sessions. We've heard 9+ events you can see on our website. The videos are there, talking about how were the programs managed? Did the money get to the right people? When it got there, what were the roadblocks in place? And we've heard from a lot of state and local officials, as you'll see if you go and look at those programs, about what those challenges were. We're going to keep doing those programs. If you have ideas on that, let us know. We want to do more of that. We're not just here to, big part of what we're doing is now looking at fraud, arresting people. We're obviously that makes news. But we are also have a very substantial amount of our resources focused on what happened here. Did the money get to the people it was intended to serve? Did it reach underserved communities, those most in need? So let us know where we can help by having programs, listening programs like that. Go to our website, give us the feedback. And then lastly, last slide, sign up, connect with us for our newsletter. You'll see we regularly are issuing reports on the work we're doing, updating everybody on how what our reports say, and sign up and give us feedback, and look forward to answering your questions today. And with that, Rose, I'll pass it on to the next panelist.
Thanks, Mike. Just before we jump to Treasury, a couple quick questions came in, if you don't mind. And if you have the answer now, great. If not, we can follow up with you. But the first one is, when will the P&E report due January 31st be released? And then the second is whether report 2 for covering October through December of 2021, will that still be due on January 31st?
So on the latter, my understanding is yes. On the former, I'll need to follow up, and I'll touch base while others are speaking and see if I can get an answer while this is ongoing.
Perfect. So why don't we turn it over to Richard Delmar, the Deputy IG at Treasury. And Richard, the floor is yours. Thanks so much, Mike.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Good morning. I'm Rich Delmar. I'm the Deputy IG at Treasury. With me today is Debbie Harker, our Assistant IG for Audit, and it is her office that is doing really the bulk of the work on oversight and in some cases monitoring and actually recoupment. And the people that you're most likely to be dealing with as we conduct our oversight. Overall, our office has responsibility for doing oversight of well over $600 billion worth of money going out the door through various programs. We actually do oversight of a dozen programs. We're going to talk about 3 of them today. If you could move to slide 3, please. Okay, the 3 programs that we're going to focus on today are the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which was initiated with CARES in March of 2020. That's the $150 billion pot of money. And we actually do recoupment of that. There are 2 emergency rental assistance programs that came up, one in the Fiscal 21 Omnibus Appropriation, and the second in the American Rescue Plan Act. We do recoupment on the first of those. And then lastly, the big one, which came out as part of ARPA, are the state and local fiscal recovery funds. So the amounts of money we're talking about there, it's $150 billion for the CRF, $47 billion for the 2 emergency rental assistance programs, $350 billion for the state and local fiscal recovery funds. Let's look at CRF. That's the one that's been going on the longest. The key there is that the money that state, local, territorial, and tribal governments get under that program have to be dedicated to necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency with respect to COVID. They have to be for costs that were not accounted for in the budget most recently approved as of March 27th, 2020, which was the date of enactment of the CARES Act. And lastly, were incurred between March 1st of 2020 and December 31st of 2021, last week. Next slide. Okay. There are reporting timelines, of course, into the portal that we helped set up with Grant Solutions. Quarterly reporting has to be no later than 10 days after the end of each calendar quarter. A big change that happened just before Christmas was the department modifying the definition of incurred to make it obligations that were made as of December 31st, 2021. That's a significant clarification, which should make it easier to use a lot of that money. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a big concept, and I'm going to ask Debbie to talk about this. We are doing what we call desk reviews, which are not formal audits, but they are a way of quickly checking in with the reports that the recipients of the funds have made to make sure that the money is actually being used, that the reports are accurately reflecting the uses to which the money was put. Debbie, if you could flesh out
Sure.
what your shop does in these desk reviews.
Yes. So just as Rich noted, for Coronavirus Relief Fund and Emergency Rental Assistance number 1, the one that was passed under Consolidated Appropriations, we are performing desk reviews. And the reason there is that we have under those 2 pieces of legislation, monitoring and recoupment authority, which is not a traditional IG. Typically we do audits and investigations. We have this additional authority. So in accordance with our monitoring authority, we are doing desk reviews. And really it's simply put, we do not go on site. We ask for documentation from the recipients to support their reporting into the Grant Solutions portal. We review that. When you are selected for a desk review, you will get a notification that you're under desk review. And note, if you get selected for an audit, that is different, and we will distinguish which you are under. And we do these based on risk. We look at things like other reports from state auditors, single audit reports, complaints that have come in through our Office of Investigations or through the PRAC. And then we select based on a risk model that we have put together with the PRAC. We have worked with them to create a risk model and to focus our desk reviews to focus on the most risky transactions. We'll select a sample. We'll ask you to provide documentation. If everything checks out, then that's the end of that. If we think that a further, more in-depth review is required, we will initiate a full-blown audit, and you will get a notification letter on that. And I will say that any recoupment, if we do find misuse or unallowable uses of funds, any recoupment that we seek will be based on an audit, not on a desk review. So again, the desk reviews are meant to be in and out quicker. If we do find something that we want to look into further, we will notify you of an actual audit. So back to you, Rich.
Thank you, Debbie. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. The two emergency rental assistance programs that we mentioned, you can see the amounts of money and the factors that go into determining eligibility for them. As Debbie mentioned, the first one came out under the 21 Omnibus, actually gave us that recoupment authority that we also have under the CRF, where we actually make a determination after a formal due process compliant set of actions that the money needs to be pulled back. We work with Treasury's Bureau of the Fiscal Service in executing those determinations. Next slide, please. Okay, and the reporting obligations, it gets a little more interesting with the ERA because the legislation requires the gathering and reporting of demographic information. And the information we're looking for is the number of eligible households receiving help, the acceptance rate, types of help, the amounts of household income levels, and demographic data relating to gender, race, and ethnicity of the primary recipients. And we're looking generally for amounts received, the obligations and expenditures made, and other information regarding the uses to which the money has been put. Next slide, please. Okay. The quarterly reporting, the deadline is 15 days after the end of each calendar quarter. For the first 3 quarters of last year, those reports were due at almost the end of October. Next slide, please. And for quarter 4, the reporting deadline is January 17th. So in about a week and a half from today. Okay, I mentioned the state and local fiscal recovery funds. That's the $350 billion pots of money, one for state, one for local. And I think the emphasis here is to emphasize how broadly the money is intended to be used for real needs. There's flexibility, addressing the needs of local households, small businesses, local industries, employees, infrastructure, and there is a lot of guidance out there, that shows how broadly those funds can be used. Next slide, please. Thank you. There are a number of different categories, states, territories, what are called metropolitan cities and counties with populations over 250,000 people. There's a separate category of metropolitan cities and counties with a population below 250,000, but who received more than $10 million in funding under this program. And the project and expenditure reports are due January 31st, answering that question again, and 30 days after the end of the quarter thereafter. Next, please. Okay. And again, repeating what we said earlier, and the P&E report is due by the end of April of this year, and then annually thereafter for the duration of the program. And then the rest of the time that we have, we want to talk about, if you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. There are some significant reporting issues that we think it'll be helpful to all of you to hear our thoughts on that. And again, Debbie, you are the expert on these things, so if you would take over here.
Sure. So thank you, Rich. He kind of gave an overview of the three big programs that we wanted to talk about today: the Coronavirus Relief Fund, the Emergency Rental Assistance, and the ARPA State and Local Fiscal Recovery. These are four of the key issues that have really caused the most confusion, questions received, and so I wanted to address those today. First of all, the definition of subrecipient and beneficiary and how that relates to reporting. Those definitions are global across all of these programs, but the reporting of subrecipient and beneficiary does vary. So first of all, in terms of a subrecipient, in the uniform guidance for federal assistance, that is defined, but generally I'll just say that, when means an entity, usually a non-federal entity, receives a subaward from a pass-through entity, meaning a prime recipient from the federal government or another pass-down entity. Basically, the key being that they carry out part of the federal award. So generally, a subrecipient is carrying out part of the program or part of the award, which differs from maybe someone that is just providing a good or service. So then others that receive payments under federal award programs, we call beneficiaries, but a subrecipient typically carries out part of the program. And why this is significant is that if you look at the Coronavirus Relief Fund and ERA, for example, there are reporting issues that involve these two definitions. So you may be used to, if you're dealing with federal assistance previously to the pandemic, the FSRS, the Federal Subrecipient Reporting System. Their subrecipient information is reported at a very high level, and the amount threshold is $30,000. Now, for Coronavirus Relief Fund and for ERA, you are reporting both subrecipient and beneficiary information. So if payments are made over the thresholds, and for CRF, it's $25,000, and for ERA, the Emergency Rental Assistance, it's $30,000. As long as they're not to individuals, because we do not collect information on individuals, but any other payments made, whether it's to a subrecipient or a beneficiary, are required to be reported under those two programs. So there is guidance further coming out from Treasury on ERA, and we have issued guidance on Coronavirus Relief Fund previously in our frequently asked questions for reporting on this issue. The second issue I wanted to touch upon was the FEMA cost share. And I know that our next speaker is going to talk a lot about FEMA, so I won't spend much time. But this issue primarily has come up on Coronavirus Relief Fund, and that is because initially when the Coronavirus Relief Fund was passed with the CARES Act, at that time, there was still, for many FEMA amounts, there was still a non-federal cost share, 25% that was required. And that was allowable to be charged under the Coronavirus Relief Fund, assuming that it met the other, requirements of CRF. So many entities charge their cost share under CRF, but then later in January, February, and November of 2021, in the Federal Register, the president came out with information that says that that cost share is no longer required. So recipients were that FEMA was going to cover 100%. So then that had to be reversed out of Coronavirus Relief Fund. So there is guidance on that about how to do that. And there's also been questions on the single audit reports and the CFAs that you present, how that is to be reported. And there is guidance coming out on that. I'll move to the third issue, which Rich touched upon, which was December 14th of 2021. Treasury changed the definition of incurred costs for the Coronavirus Relief Fund. This is very critical because originally your goods had to be received and your services rendered by December 31st, 2021. That has been now extended such that the obligation or the commitment or obligation to pay has to be done by December 31st, 2021. But expenditures or goods received, services delivered services rendered can happen up until 9/30, September 30th of 2022. So that's giving an additional 9 months, assuming you made those obligations by December 31st, to have the goods delivered or the services rendered. So that is an extension, and that will push back closeout of the Coronavirus Relief Fund until after that 9/30/2022 date. And last, I wanted to just quickly touch upon the lost revenue issues under the State and Local Fiscal Recovery for American Rescue Plan. This has been a huge issue. I will note that Treasury has stated that the final rule is coming out in January, so we're closely looking for that. They have committed that it's coming out in January. And a couple things I just wanted to point out there that have been hot topics on this. First of all, I will say that this is a big difference between the Coronavirus Relief Fund and the state and local ARPA funds. Coronavirus Relief Fund does not allow lost revenue where this fund, state and local, does. So that's a big difference. Also, a couple things to pay close attention to: the types of revenue, the general revenue from the census definition of sources owned. The census has kind of the guidance, and Treasury's put out guidance in the interim final rule on how to determine which revenue will be included. Also, the intergovernmental revenue do not include federal intergovernmental revenue, but also look closely at intergovernmental revenue between states and locals. And there is criteria to determine who accounts for that revenue in their calculation. So those are some key things to pay attention to. Also, just about the audits, wanted to note that the lost revenue calculation is just the limit or the maximum. It's not what is actually the amount that will be allowable. It's the limit or maximum by which you will then charge the government services that are allowable. So what is on the CFA and your single audit report is those government services that are allowable up to the maximum lost revenue. And finally, the compliance supplement for the single audits does state that this fiscal year 2021, the lost revenue calculation will not be audited. So I will stop there and turn it back. And thank you for letting us present today. Turn it back to our presenter.
Thank you, Debbie, so much. And also want to thank Rich. I want to start just pulling a couple of questions out of the chat box because they are starting to come in fast and furious. And then, as I said, we will also have a QA session at the end. So I'm going to go through a couple that came in for Rich and Debbie, and I'm going to ask my Bloomberg colleagues to start pulling out the other ones that are coming in real time here, following up with these. The first is, Treasury requires the identification of evidence-based practices for use of the state and local fiscal recovery funds in certain expense categories. Can you talk about whether and how the articulation of a project as evidence-based practice will be reviewed and approved and potentially questioned by you? And then the second part of that question, does Treasury have a list of EBPs that it has approved or that it would approve to make it easier for cities to be able to fit those in?
Debbie, I defer to you.
Thanks, Rose. That is something that Treasury did include in the state and local fiscal recovery that wasn't included in other programs. We are working with them on that. And so I do not have an answer for that today. I think I will defer in terms of the list of practices. That'll be a question we would have to pose to Treasury. But in terms of how we will review that, we are still working with Treasury to determine that and to make sure we fully understand their requirements there. So apologize, I can't give, but that's something we could follow up on. But the part about the list, that would come from Treasury, so I can facilitate getting that.
Wonderful, Debbie. I will definitely follow up with you on that, and then we can share that information. Terrific. Another question came in, which is, how can we submit an SL FRF P&E report without there being a template on the portal? And so I'm just going to supplement that with my own question, which is there a template that folks may utilize for that?
So it's my understanding that, and again, I'll be honest, we're not in charge. We're in charge of the reporting for Coronavirus Relief Fund, not for state and local fiscal recovery. So again, I would have to defer to Treasury, but full reporting, including the P&E, was due for quarters 1, 2, and 3 by October 29th. So unless I'm sorry. I'm confusing ERA. So you're right. The submission that's due in January. I'm not positive because I'm not responsible for that reporting. So that's a question I'd have to take back to Treasury.
We'd appreciate it if you could do that. That's great, and
Yep.
I'll get back with you on that. Any templates obviously are well received and highly desired by folks that need to comply with these requirements. The next question has to do with the issuance of the final rules for ARPA, and I know that you're not directly responsible, but cities have been following the interim rules, and there are some concerns that have been articulated here today and outside just the chat box here today about potential differentials between the interim rules and the final rules, and jurisdictions having problems having followed the interim rules and then have a course change take place with the final rules. So do you have any idea about when the final rules will be coming out? I think they were due out in the late fall. And then what would your advice be for jurisdictions that see some sort of change between the interim and the final rules?
So 2 things about that. We've been told the final rule will be out in January. So that's what we've been told by Treasury, who's responsible for it. We are also very aware of changing, rules or guidance when we do the audits. And I do think that, one of the reasons maybe the lost revenue calculation isn't being audited in 2021 is they want to make sure that some of the final rules and details are out. We are the ones who audit against the rules. And so certainly we're going to be taking into consideration the rules that were in place at the time. Now, with that said, the interim final rule is the best guidance. If it subsequently changes, we will have to keep all of that in consideration. We are aware of it and we are talking with Treasury as we go through it. I am not aware, because they have not made us aware of what exactly the changes will be. In other words, what's going to be different between, I have no more insight than you do on what will be different between the interim final rule and the final rule. And so we're anxiously awaiting that too, to see how much it will affect reporting and auditing.
Thank you,
Great.
Debbie. And I'm just going to jump in with another question that I think relates to the auditing perspective. So Rhonda Klein asks, even though the OMB compliance supplement will not require testing of the lost revenue calculation, in order for auditors to test the accuracy of the SEFA reporting, wouldn't that require auditors to test that calculation?
Yeah, so those expenditures that were put in for government services in the fiscal year 2021, I think they'll be looking at the expenditures for allowability, but, in terms of a lost revenue calculation cap, I don't think they're going to be looking at that cap in 2021. I think it's what it's saying is they're not looking at the lost revenue calculation for the max limit, but they would look at, are those expenditures for government services allowable, which is sort of, two different, that's two different issues. So I hope that that's clear. Again, the lost revenue calculation is your limit, but the government services that you charge, those have to be allowable under the current definition. So it makes, and I don't know, I don't want to fully speculate, but it makes me wonder if they are concerned about the lost revenue calculation, and more clarification might be coming out in the final rule, which is why they're saying don't audit it yet. But again, I think we'll all have to see when they issue the final rule. But those government services, I think, are pretty clearly defined. It's just a matter of what the limit to them will be. I hope that makes sense.
We had
Adam,
another
did
question
you
that,
jump in?
yeah, we had another question that tried asking about whether civil rights compliance will be part of the January reporting that's coming up.
I don't know the answer to that. That would be a question I would have to pose to Treasury. Again, we're not really responsible for the reporting. So like the templates and, the question that was asked earlier, I would ask, when they were asking the question about the template, are they trying to do online reporting, or are they trying to do an upload? Is that the template they're asking about? The upload template versus online would be, versus doing it through the portal? That would be a question I would have. We'll pose some of these to Treasury, who's responsible.
Great, the follow-up was really helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we have a few more. Connor Harmon asks, how do we fulfill the reporting requirements to show we are serving a disadvantaged community? For example, on category 3.11 services for unhoused persons, are we supposed to attempt to track the homeless beneficiaries' income, or can it be assumed that they meet the requirements of under 60% median income?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that question, Rose. I apologize. If you could repeat it.
No worries. How do we fulfill the reporting requirements to show we are serving a disadvantaged community? For example, on category 3.11 services for unhoused persons, are we supposed to attempt to track the homeless beneficiaries' income, or can it be assumed that they meet the requirements of under 60% median income?
Yeah, that's going to be a question I have to pose to Treasury. They're the policy maker, so we have to pose that to Treasury.
Okay. Jamie or Adam, any other questions in the queue?
It looks like the rest of the questions are sort of in that same bucket of about the reporting. And so maybe we can move to the DHS presentation, and then we can save those for the end. Thank you.
Great. Joe, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Rose, and thanks for this opportunity to discuss our COVID-related work at the Department of Homeland Security, IG, and two important lines of work that impact you directly: disaster management oversight and the impact of fraud schemes in your communities. When the effects of COVID-19 hit your towns and cities, you had to spring into action and throw everything you had at the problem. There was PPE to acquire, vaccines to distribute, hospitals that needed ventilators, and most importantly, friends and neighbors that lost work and loved ones during the pandemic. They needed recovery resources, and they needed them immediately. Following all disaster declarations, FEMA is essential to helping communities recover, in this case, from the impact of the pandemic. As the IG of the Department of Homeland Security, my job is to provide oversight of FEMA along with the other major components of the department. Today, I'm going to share with you lessons learned from our work at DHS IG that can improve the way you protect your communities when you have disasters that strike, including COVID. Hopefully making work with FEMA funding as seamless and as fraud-free as possible. Slide 2, please. I'm going to overview some questions to consider when seeking reimbursement from FEMA for COVID-related expenses, and I will share tips to ensure compliance when using these funds. I will also discuss our office's audits and investigations and provide our contact information. Slide 3, please. You know that disaster zones affect and attract real-life heroes. First responders, volunteers, faith groups, nonprofits, and obviously mayors, all dedicated to doing the right thing. But disaster zones also attract villains, people who prey on the weak, take advantage of taxpayers' generosity to line their own pockets. So how do you secure and distribute the aid quickly and efficiently to your town while also keeping the bad guys at bay? Here are some important questions to consider for FEMA COVID funding. Same questions that are fundamental to all disaster fundings. I'll make these available so you don't have to write them down. First is our claim cost related to the disasters. Was work authorized under the project scope? Are costs adequately supported by documentation? Are costs reasonable and necessary? Are costs reduced by credits such as insurance and salvage value? Does the contract meet all federal procurement regulations? Are there any signs of fraud by the applicant or the contractor? As I will talk about in more detail later, if you see something, say something. Slide 4, please. So with these questions in mind, here are some tips to ensure FEMA COVID funding is in compliance. You designate a person or a team to coordinate the accumulation of records. You established a separate and distinct accounting for recording revenue and expenditures that have a unique identifier specifically for FEMA COVID projects. Ensure that the final claim for each project is supported by amounts recorded. Also ensure expenditures are recorded in the accounting books and are supported by source documentation. Ensure that your expenditures are claimed under FEMA COVID project are reasonable and necessary. And ensure proper grant administration is established. In addition to this list of suggestions, I also talk about, I will send you links to our COVID audits, a DHS OIG 2017 report that summarizes these concepts and FEMA's COVID resource roadmaps. Finally, disclaimer from the lawyers. This list does not constitute legal advice. It is not intended and does not create any right or benefit enforceable by law by any party or litigant. With that said, let's go to slide number 5, please. Occasionally, as you know, things don't go as planned. The lessons learned from these moments can be helpful to you to prevent future unallowable costs. Therefore, I'm going to briefly describe and send you 2 DHS audits that help illustrate how to minimize the loss of FEMA Disaster Assistance Fund and maximize your financial recovery. I am using what I hope are clear examples from previous disasters. These lessons can be applied to FEMA COVID funding. The first example involves money spent by schools in Missouri following devastating tornadoes in 2011. Here, the lack of federal contracting expertise was apparent and resulted in a major overbilling to the federal government. This report can be found on our website. And as I said, I'm going to send that in a link. Slide 6, please. And another
reimbursements and such stuff instead, you know?
And another example, following Hurricane Harvey, FEMA awarded monies to Harris County, Texas for reimbursement of disaster-related costs, including debris removal and emergency protective services. Harris County did not comply with federal procurement regulations and FEMA guidance when awarding these contracts. Instead, Harris County awarded contracts in compliance with state law. As a result, we questioned $2.7 million in costs related to not following the federal procurement regulations. The takeaway from both of these examples is that at a local and state level, you need to support the people who understand federal grant processes and who can help ensure compliance. These programs require careful navigation. I hope these suggestions are helpful to you and your communities. Slide 7, please. This pandemic obviously is unprecedented. It's equivalent to a local disaster in almost every community in the world. And we can all think of the incredible people, the heroes who have shown up to help: mayors, selfless healthcare professionals, the National Guard, governors, volunteers, and our friends and neighbors. I'm sincerely humbled by the example of care and selflessness that I have witnessed in the last 2 years. But there are also people who show up to take advantage of a tough situation. People want to intercept the great pots of money designated for the sick, the grieving, and the unemployed. Real life villains. As you probably know, these kinds of fraud schemes have far-reaching consequences for you at the local level. And I want to share important information to help you better protect your communities from these bad actors. My office has identified companies that bid on and won a Homeland Security contracts in excess of $90 million to provide PPE, which would have ultimately been provided to states for first responders. These first responders were relying on that equipment to provide services to your towns. The only problem is these small companies had no way to provide the equipment. It was all a sham. We engaged in proactive efforts with mass supply companies and asked, how could these tiny companies provide all the PPE so quickly? Short answer was they couldn't. I'm happy to report that the company officials were indicted and subsequently pled guilty. We are confident that these outcomes would deter future fraud and allow legitimate competition for life-saving equipment for your communities. Slide number 8, please. We've also been monitoring the massive amounts of federal money that's going out to available to individuals. Congress also authorized FEMA more than $45 billion to provide to individuals hurt by the pandemic. It arrived at FEMA under 2 separate programs: extra federal unemployment supplements, referred to as lost wages assistance, and funeral assistance reimbursements. We're working closely with our colleagues, Michael Horowitz, Department of Justice, and the Department of Labor IG to identify hundreds of millions of dollars of pandemic fraud cases. These cases take many forms, and it may be no surprise that some of these pandemic relief funds are winding up in the hands of drug trafficking organizations. As you know, large infusions of money into the wrong hands has a negative impact on you and your local community. For example, my office investigated fraud schemes across the US. These have resulted in enforcement actions where guns and drugs were seized. In these instances, my office worked collaboratively with local police to ensure these individuals, some of whom were convicted felons, were charged appropriately and hopefully decrease the violent crimes in your community. One scheme you may have already seen or heard about is that criminals were using their influence and their large networks to fraudulently obtain unemployment benefits inside and outside of state penitentiary systems. We expect to see dozens of indictments in the coming months from our multi-state investigations. We have already had a significant federal prosecution in the state of Virginia, in which federal supplemental unemployment benefits were claimed by Virginia state prisoners. I'm grateful to report that the ringleaders have been brought to justice. The Virginia case involved hundreds of thousands of fraudulently obtained FEMA dollars. We are seeing similar patterns of pandemic payments winding up in other state prison systems across the country. And I know we will be busy for the upcoming years. Slide number 9, please. By working together, we can help ensure federal monies end up in the right hands, which in turn helps keep your community safe. Here are some signs to look for and to report to the Department of Homeland Security, IG. Citizens may contact you regarding benefits for which they did not apply. There may be unknown or unusual credit report notifications. There may be unemployment benefits requested from the same IP address as been previously discussed, or from a concealed IP address. Multiple benefit credit and debit cards have been mailed to the same address. Unemployment benefits have been sent to out-of-state recipients, sometimes from multiple states. And benefits are being paid to virtual wallets like the Green Dot, Venmo, and PayPal. Slide 10, please. If you see evidence of these COVID fraud schemes, please report them to us. I will send you our hotline information and other resources that I mentioned. Thank you for your time, and thank you for what you do every day to support our cities and towns, especially through this pandemic. My team of experts and I are standing by for your questions. Thank you.
Great,
Thank you very
so much. Yeah, one just to hop in.
Ask Adam to jump in here.
Perfect, thank you, Rose. Wanted to jump in with a question from James Beach. For metropolitan counties and cities, there's a report that's due on January 31st, and it's to cover the period between the award date and December 31st, 2021. This is a change from the previously communicated October due date for the project and expenditure report, and they just wanted to confirm that that is indeed correct and understand what is supposed to be due and what periods does it cover.
I'm uncertain, Adam, if that's in our wheelhouse. It looks like Debbie was shaking her head. She may have more information to share with you.
Yeah, I think that's a question related to, just to confirm, because we talked about 3 different programs, but I'm assuming they're talking about state and local. ARPA is the question. And there were interim reports due, but the full report was pushed back, the full reporting to January 31st, as was mentioned. That's correct.
Perfect. And James, if you were asking about something different or more specific, just throw it into the chat and we'll make sure we can address that as well.
Fantastic. And there was one more question that got through before we turned it over to Joe for Debbie and Rich. And it has to do with lost revenue funds being used for general services. So Frank Whitfield indicates that it's loud and clear that the audit will judge whether the service has been determined based upon the what's allowable through SEFA. However, the resources that do get freed up because ARPA is being used for general services such as police and fire, with those additional funds freed up from the general fund, will those be audited differently than how they have been in the past?
So yeah, let me address that. So what I wanted to make clear was the general services in Treasury's FAQs, frequently asked questions for the state and local fiscal recovery. I think it's 3.8, but it talks about, and it's pretty straightforward. I mean, there are very broad uses of general services like police and fire, as he mentions here, PAYGO infrastructure, Obviously, well, maybe it's not obvious. It's obvious because of the FAQ, not pension funds, not rainy day funds, not sort of tax anticipation notes, debt, etc. I mean, there are things that are yes, and there are things that are no. So that's what I initially meant by, I think they're pretty clear on what those general services are, and they're very broad. And I think to Frank's question, what is charged on the CFA, in terms of those, I mean, they'll be audited similarly. I mean, in the sense that you have to have support for police and fire, and the type of documentation, support, et cetera, you would have to have under audit is the same documentation. I think, what it is that you will be delineating that on your CFA is a charge under the assistance listing or CFDA number for not coronavirus relief fund, state and local fiscal recovery fund for ARPA. And so, yes, you will have to provide the support for that pay-go infrastructure, for that police and fire. And yes, that would be audited just as traditionally as audited. Do you have the support? Is it allowable? Is it reasonable, supported, et cetera? So I hope that answers the question. And if anyone is questioning where I was saying general services is defined, it's definitely defined in Treasury's FAQs.
And I think Frank has a follow-up. He's going to jump in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for that, Debbie. And thank you all for putting this together. This is what many of us cities and managers are dealing with right now. Literally, I got a meeting this afternoon around making a legislation about this. So this is so timely, and I'm thankful for it. So definitely I'm clear on that. Now, the question is, an example in our city is that we're planning, there's certain things we want to do that we know if we try to do it straight through ARPA, that is going to be very complicated, a lot of red tape, and there's just not a lot of guidance. So the thought is utilize the lost revenue, supplement our police and fire, then the general fund money that we relieve, use that to do the sort of economic development work that we want to do, with the expectation it won't be judged under the same criteria as ARPA. So, so I'm clear on the us documenting our police that we're paying out of ARPA and fire and everything. But the thing is, now this new bucket of money has freed up that we had in our general fund that we want to use for economic development. Is there anything that we need to be concerned about as we do that?
I think, that is addressed somewhere. I'd have to go back. It's specifically addressed in the various, whether it's the interim final rule or the FAQs. I know I've read about that, but the short answer is, under audit, we're not going to look at what you do with freed up funds, because you're not charging, it's what you're specifically charging to the federal government, or putting on your CFA as allowable expenditures for general services. So, and I think there is the fact, and this happened under coronavirus relief fund, frankly, for public health and safety, where public health and safety freed up a lot of funding for folks. And then they went off, and we got a lot of investigative complaints because localities, states, freed up and charged state public health and safety that they would normally have, which was allowable under coronavirus relief fund, therefore freeing up money that was then used for other things that weren't allowable under CRF. That's not our jurisdiction. What we look at is what you're charging to the federal funding. So it has to be an allowable general service up to the limit of your lost revenue. That's what we will be looking at.
Thank you.
So I hope that
was it. Thank you.
CRF is the exact example with public health and safety, because we got complaints about that. And oftentimes we would go in and find, no, they didn't charge that to CRF. They did that with freed up money because of public health and safety that they did charge to CRF.
Yep. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. I know a number of people, may have some follow-ups, and anybody who wants to come on camera, as Frank just did, and do any follow-ups, just let Jamie Levin know that right now. And while folks are contemplating that, why don't we have Jamie, I think you were going to execute on a brief poll. Want to just take a second to do that?
And to answer Ed's question, the presentation and the recording and the resources that Rose mentioned will all be posted to the website shortly following it.
Good afternoon. This is Gerard from the city of Newark. Is it okay if I ask a quick question?
Yes, please.
Perfect. I just wanted to follow up and just brief context. We were able to just about exhaust our funds here from the emergency rental assistance. So we're pretty excited about that, proud of the fact that we were able to get those funds out. But in the midst of such, our admin vendor and our team here at the city found a number of cases of suspected fraud. And so we're in the process of putting together a package which pretty much, identifies who's suspected, why, documentation, and so forth. We saw that the Treasury did issue some guidance approximately 2 weeks ago. It's not in great detail, but this is specifically to, again, ERA and the U.S. Treasury. So the OIG hotline information that was provided, would that be, is that okay to reach out to someone there? Would that be a good source? Because obviously, there may be some, some questions that are kind of specific to our cases in our jurisdiction that we may need assistance with. So is that is this the recommended information to use, or would you suggest that we reach out to a specific person to contact at the Treasury instead?
So first of all, thank you. That's very important what you mentioned, because you will want to report that to the federal agency, as you talked about. And the appropriate place to report that is through our OIG complaint hotline. Rich, do you have that exact email address? If you,
I took screenshots, so if it's what you provided just earlier.
Okay, yes. So if you get it there, absolutely, we will get it to the right place at OIG intake, which is our complaint. So send it to what we put on the screens, and absolutely, as long as you get it to OIG, we will get it to our investigative complaint, the right email inbox from there.
All right, perfect. We're just about done compiling the comprehensive package, and so we'll email that along with a few questions.
And if I could just ask which City of Newark, New Jersey.
Right, City of Newark,
Okay,
right.
Great. We'll be on the lookout for that, and really appreciate you mentioning that.
And I'll just jump in on that also. We're going to thank you for doing that. That is very important, very helpful, and for all the reasons we've indicated. And one of the things we're going to do is from the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, PRAC, we'll leave points of contact generally with Rose and the folks from Bloomberg to get out to all of you, so that you have follow-ups if you have questions generally, if it's not agency specific, or even frankly, if it is agency specific, we can get you to the right person.
Perfect, thanks.
Well, I'm not surprised that the City of Newark is on its toes. Bloomberg Associates works very closely with the City of Newark, and as Mike just indicated, we'll make sure, in addition to your screenshots, that you get everything that you need from us by way of the necessary follow-up. We are a little bit beyond time, but the questions are still rolling in. If our federal guests could just bear with us maybe for a few minutes. Linda McDermott, do you want to jump on and ask your question about equipment and ARPA funding?
Yes, I'd love to. Hello from sunny Florida. I'm in West Palm Beach. And my challenge is I'm used to 25 years of doing grants, and the supplanting is always in the back of my mind, and I'm very cautious. But we have had where the cost of equipment, materials, supplies is going up anywhere between 7% to 25% on making our police department vehicle purchases, our EMS truck, our garbage trucks, to the point that we have had to hold back on other expenditures in our general fund. So we have already allocated 1/2 of our ARPA dollars that we are buying some equipment. However, to the extent of the revenue piece, now beyond the revenue loss, how can I now make up for these huge differences? Let me give you an example. We had a compactor that the cost increased 40% because they can't even get the steel and they had to go to another market. We are finding a lot of difficulties. Now our equipment maintenance costs to keep the EMS vehicle running is getting more expensive because we can't get them replaced, and it's taking 1 year to 1.5 years. We can't even get guarantee on the police, the EMS, and these are first responder vehicles. We have a bomb truck that's no longer working. We are having a very hard time funding. We used to get forfeiture dollars because of COVID. This has been going on for almost 2 years that they have not been able to engage in a lot of the activities that might have brought in some forfeiture dollars. So, you know, on and on and on. The repercussions of COVID are causing other things to make us hold back on what we really need, because I need to know, where can I fit this in ARPA funding, because the next tranche of money coming out, it's my responsibility to provide administration with how can we fund all of these things with ARPA, and can we, and where do I go from there?
That's a multi-part question. I mean, some of which is, I would think, actually going to have to be addressed to, you know, the legislature. You know, I think state and local, you know, the theme is that there is a lot of flexibility. Again, I think from the perspective of us as doing oversight, you know, we're looking for compliance with the guidance as the guidance comes out, and you know, justification. You know, but you know, at the end of the day, like for instance, you mentioned the forfeiture fund. You know, while we do oversight of the Treasury forfeiture fund, you know, it can give out only what it gets in, and that is going through a lot of hoops. And you know, there are a lot of questions these days about, you know, the entire value and justification of civil forfeiture. So, you know, you're probably going to have more issues with that going forward. So that's not a satisfactory answer, I am sure, but you know, I understand the complexity, and you know, we see it too. You know,
so I mean, I
think
think,
you want to supplement that.
yeah, I mean, I think if you want to submit the question in writing, we can provide, I mean, obviously, you know, per the rules, the broad, you know, broadband infrastructure, I mean, the broad categories, general services, et cetera. So I think it's like looking at specific situations and seeing how they fit in. And if there are some specific questions you have, if you want to pose them, we can certainly, you know, pose them to Treasury and try to work with you on that.
Okay, thank you.
So just one more while we just have another extra minute here, running out of time. But and this is likely a policy question, not an OIG question, but to Rich and Debbie, do you have any indication as to whether or not the final rules will speak in any detail on focusing on the use and support of Black and brown businesses, MBEs, in regards to encouraging goals?
We have not received any information as to what will be in the final rule, how it will be different than the interim final rule. I do know that the administration obviously is very focused on, that funds are available and equity issues. But with that said, no, I have no more insight than you do into what will be in the final rule. So we're all going to have to just wait.
So just, we held this webinar because we knew that there was going to be a plethora of questions, and there has been. I just want to take a moment to go through with everybody how we can do follow-up for questions that require additional information or follow-up through our very generous guest speakers. As Jamie indicated in the chat, the program, the e311 program, does a newsletter periodically, and there'll be additional follow-up information in it. And it may also indicate that you should go to the hub that Adam talked about, our program website. You can do that once a week anyway. You can wait for the newsletter to tell you to go to it with follow-ups. But, there's just timelines bearing down on folks. We realize that we may just do a separate email to you folks on this webinar saying, go to the website. We've updated it with some of the answers to questions from this webinar. Last but not least, I just put my email into the chat box. If anybody has any residual questions or follow-ups from today, and I can feel that you do from looking at this chat, I am going to put together the follow-ups that we have for Debbie, and I think there was maybe one or two for Mike and for Joe, into a follow-up document to her. So if anybody wants to email me anything that they did not get an opportunity to ask or has a follow-up on, feel free to do that, and I'll include that in my email communication to the Treasury IG. And then last but not least, I don't know if there's anybody else who wants to follow up. We've got maybe Casey or Melanie. If anybody wants to come on camera and ask an additional question now, please feel free to do so. We have another minute or two, I hope, for that. So if anybody wants to jump on with a question.
This is Melanie Keaton with the City of San Antonio. I just have hopefully two very quick ones. ERA 1 reallocation funds. We were just thankfully awarded a little bit of that. Will that be under a new award number, or will it be under the original ERA 1 number, so that when we do the compliance reports, we just go back and increase that, or it's a new grant award?
That is a perfect question, Melanie, and we have posed the same thing to Treasury ourselves. And so, yes, please, Rose, if you will get that question forward, we're already trying to get the answer on that question. We've asked them, Treasury, how they're going to do those reallocation funds in terms of award numbers and et cetera. So don't know the answer, but we've already posed the question, and we would definitely get back to you.
Thank you. The second quick one is going back to the state and local fiscal recovery revenue replacement. Because so we're going to use the money for governmental services. When we use it for governmental services, do we have to follow uniform guideline procurement rules, or do we just follow our normal city procurement rules for then the freed up money, if you will?
So if you're going to be using it under federal funding and federal purposes, you have to follow the requirements that are outlined in your terms and agreements for state and local fiscal recovery. And I don't want to say right off the top of my head, because different programs, whether it's CRF or state and local, have outlined different which parts of uniform guidance apply, right? I mean, I think you know what I'm talking about, but you do have to follow the federal, your terms and agreements and the federal things that do apply to those programs if you're charging it to the program, yes.
So that's even if we're using revenue replacement. So for example, if we have a huge convention operations that got just impacted by this. And so we have component units that's doing marketing. So we're giving them basically money to go back to do marketing, but they're a component unit. So I wouldn't normally go out and do bids and stuff, but I lost like $100 million just in hospitality. So we're using then that money for other replacement, but I may not put it in hospitality. I may use it somewhere else, you know?
Well, it's a good question. So put that question in writing and pose it. And let me run it past the Treasury guru, who I know personally, who deals with, you know, the uniform guidance rules and so let's make sure what Treasury would say on that, because they're the policymaker. I hear what you're saying, because it's different than the straight out expenditures, because you're saying they're under revenue, or lost revenue and general service. So let me double check on that. That way we'll have a for sure answer. It's a good question. It's a good question. My gut is the first answer I gave, but you know what? You're bringing up some good nuances to the question. So let me confirm. Yep.
Great. And Melanie, I just DM'd you so we can follow up with each other. And Casey Brown, did you want to jump in?
I did. Good morning, everyone. Casey Brown, Chief Financial Officer for the City of Shreveport. And I had a general question in regards to the guidance for staffing levels. The last guidance that was released talked about being able to hire staff back to pre-pandemic levels. And just wanted to know what documentation is going to be looked at in order to talk about those hiring back to that staffing level pre-pandemic. What documentation is going to be needed or looked at in order to justify that spending?
It's a good question. And so which category are you putting this? Is this going to be under lost revenue, hiring back to pre-pandemic levels, or under another category?
Well, there were a couple of different categories that we were looking at. One particularly that talked about hiring public safety employees
Right.
to mitigate response to COVID-19. That was one of them. But then also it did talk about public health workers. But then it also mentioned staff in general. I thought to speak about getting back to pre-pandemic levels. So that was a big question. You know, is it just public safety? Is it just public health? Or is it all staff? Because I think everybody from a hiring perspective, from a workforce, has been affected by COVID-19 and being able to hire staff. So just wanted to see what staff was included and what documentation is going to be needed.
That's a good question. And if you pose that one, rather than answer it off the cuff, because it's not something that I've thought about before, I think that's a good question that we can get a follow-up on.
If I can, if I can supplement in an incredible example of great timing, the department just issued its final rule for state and local fiscal recovery funds programs to support the ongoing COVID response, which I have forwarded to Rose, which I am sure she will share with everybody.
Amazing.
Oh boy,
Amazing.
reading after I get off the call. Wow, yay, that's very timely.
Live updates.
That's right.
Okay.
I'm not going to claim
I'm
not going to claim that we made that happen, but
we're going to give you the credit for it, my friend.
Thank you.
Wow. All right. That is literally hot off the presses and indeed well timed. Thank you so much, Rich, for that. We have gone past the 90-minute mark. I've never been on a workshop where 154 people stay for more than an hour and a half. The questions are still coming in, and I think I just want to do a touch base with our IG colleagues on the call. Do you have time for another couple, or would you like me to follow up with folks? And they're going to do so. I've given my email in the chat box. I'm happy to take in the questions and do this by way of follow-up as well. I'm going to defer.
I think it's more efficient to get the questions in writing. That way we know exactly, what we're being asked to find out.
And with the final rule just coming out, that may also be something that people need to digest a little bit and then can have follow-up. So why don't we just adjourn? we are, I've got the message from Dayton, and we'll loop Dayton into the same questions that San Antonio has. And there's a number of other follow-ups as well. We're not going anywhere. You have my email, you have Jamie's email, Adam's email. You have the website for the e311 hub. You're going to be getting the newsletter, and you will get any special all-point bulletin emails that we feel the need to send to you in light of some of these deadlines as we get follow-up information and answers to questions from these 4 outstanding public servants who just spent this time with us and who do such a great job. I want to thank each and every one of them for their service, both now and throughout their careers. And I've had many conversations with the cities on the line and many conversations with them. And I think we're just all on the same page in terms of what each of them has said, each of the 4 of them has said, which is that this is just about helping people, but with transparency and accountability and making sure that the money gets into the right hands. So totally salute these 3 departments for what they're doing, as well as our wonderful city colleagues. So get back to your budget meetings and some of the other planning meetings that are happening today with some of this information that you now have, and we will do very robust follow-up with you and for you. And again, be in touch, don't hesitate. Mike, my friend, thanks as always. Hope to see you soon in person. Rich, Debbie, and Joe as well.
Thank you, Rose.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good week.